Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're diving deep as always, and today it's going to be into this guy, Elon Musk.
Yeah, we all know Elon Musk, right? The Tesla guy, SpaceX. But he's kind of a lot more than that these days, isn't he?
He really is. It's like you can't really get away from him, can you? I mean, he's just everywhere. He's in the news all the time. And like you said, it's not just cars and rockets anymore. It's like he's wading into geopolitics. He's taking over social media.
Yeah, and that's what's really fascinating about him, right? I mean, it's not just about the companies he builds, but it's this whole like persona that he's cultivated, and it's having a real impact on the world.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dig into today. So we're going to try to answer the question, like, how did this, kind of quirky engineer who liked building rockets end up being this like globally influential figure?
Right. And to do that, we're going to be looking at excerpts from this really interesting podcast called Musk Unfiltered: Fame, Power, and the Politics of Innovation.
Yeah, it's a great title, right? And it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. It's not just about him as a CEO or an engineer. It's about this whole phenomenon of Elon Musk and how he's using his fame and his power to influence the world.
And for us, we want to understand what happens when somebody like that steps onto the global stage. I mean, he's not a politician, but he's definitely got a political voice.
Totally. So I guess to start off, like, where does this all begin for him?
So the podcast goes way back to, his early days. He was born in South Africa in 1971. I mean, not that many people know that.
I didn't actually, yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised too. And even as a kid, he was clearly brilliant. I mean, he coded his own video game at like 12 years old.
Oh, yeah, Blaster.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's not your average 12-year-old.
No, definitely not. So
Yeah.
he was obviously, super smart from a very young age. But how does he end up in the U.S.?
So after South Africa, he spent some time in Canada and eventually made his way to the U.S. I mean, it's kind of the classic, Silicon Valley story in a way.
All right, chasing the dream. And then I guess the big turning point for him was PayPal.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, PayPal was his first really big success. And it wasn't just the technology itself. It was like he figured out how to build a company, how to scale it, how to get funding.
Right, and that's the blueprint he uses later on for Tesla and SpaceX.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Selling PayPal to eBay in 2002, that was a huge win. I mean, it gave him the money to do all these crazy things that nobody else thought were possible.
Yeah, I mean, to most people, starting a space company or an electric car company back then sounded absolutely insane.
Oh, totally. But that's what's so interesting about him, right? He's got this combination of like wild ambition and then the actual ability to execute.
Yeah, and the podcast really gets into that. I mean, it's not just like he's a dreamer. He's actually like a really shrewd businessman.
For sure. And I think that's what's led to his political influence as well. I mean, as his companies have gotten bigger, so has his platform.
Absolutely. And he's not afraid to use it.
Right.
Right? I mean, he's constantly tweeting about everything from, COVID lockdowns to AI to like wars.
Oh, yeah. And that's where things get really controversial. I mean,
Yeah.
some people love his outspokenness. They see him as like a truth teller, but others think he's just being reckless.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely not afraid to say what he thinks, even if it pisses people off. And that's what makes him so fascinating to follow,
Yeah.
right? You never know what he's going to say next.
And then there's the whole Twitter thing. I mean, buying it for $44 billion, that's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, I mean, he framed it as like a free speech thing,
Yeah.
right? But it definitely raises questions about his motives.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, does he really care about free speech, or is it more about having control over this huge platform?
Right. I mean, it's a pretty powerful tool to have at your disposal. And it's not just Twitter either. I mean, he's got Tesla's operations in China, which puts him right in the middle of this whole U.S.-China rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other layer of complexity, right?
Yeah.
How do you navigate that when you're a businessman, but you're also kind of a global figure?
Exactly. And the podcast quotes this political analyst who says that Musk is unique because he's both an industrialist and a public intellectual.
And that's so true, right? I mean, his opinions actually matter because he controls these companies that are so important to the future.
Yeah, it's not just talk with him. It's like his decisions can have real-world consequences, and he's meeting with world leaders. He's talking to presidents and prime ministers.
And let's not forget about the government subsidies. I mean, his companies have benefited from billions of dollars in taxpayer money.
Yeah, which raises the question, right? Should one person have this much power?
It's a good question. I mean, is he using his influence for good, or is it all about self-interest?
And the public is really divided on that.
Yeah.
I mean, some people think he's a genius, a visionary who's going to save the world.
And others think he's dangerous, that he's playing with fire.
And the podcast has some great examples of this in the Vox Populus area. They have people saying things like, Elon Musk is a genius, but he's playing with fire when it comes to politics. And then others are like, love him or hate him, he's changing the world.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how polarizing he is.
And that's what makes him so compelling, right? I mean, he's not just some boring CEO. He's this larger-than-life figure who's constantly pushing boundaries.
And he's definitely changed the way we think about things, right? From electric cars to space travel to how we communicate online.
So what do you think? What's next for him?
Well, I mean, he's always got some new project up his sleeve, right? AI, robotics, space colonization. I don't think he's slowing down anytime soon.
And the lines between his business and his politics are getting blurrier and blurrier.
Yeah, I mean, the big question is, can anyone regulate him? I mean, his companies are so powerful and he's so influential.
It's a tough one, right?
Yeah.
I mean, governments are struggling to keep up with the pace of innovation in these areas.
And the decisions they make are going to have a huge impact on Musk's future.
Yeah, for sure. So as the podcast concludes, it really comes down to this question. Is Elon Musk a force for good, or is he a threat?
It's a question that everyone has to answer for themselves. I mean, there's no easy answer.
And that's what makes this whole topic so interesting, right? It forces us to confront some really complex issues about technology power in the future.
Totally. And I think one thing that's really worth thinking about is the long-term implications of having someone like Musk who's so deeply involved in both business and politics.
Yeah, I mean, what happens when those two worlds collide like
Yeah,
they're doing now?
exactly. I mean, it's a question that's going to be with us for a long time, I think.
So that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.